Good morning, good afternoon, good day, wherever you are in the world. We are on the hour and attendees are coming in, so we'll just wait a minute or two for everybody to join and then we'll start. Right, Liam? Are you there?
I am indeed. I am indeed.
Perfect. All is working, right?
Yep, I can see people popping in now. So
Yep. Let's give everybody a minute or two and then we can start. Good evening, even. Yes, there's somebody from, what would be evening? Is that already in India? Well, in India, it's probably now already middle of the night, right?
I'm trying to think, depends where you are in India, because in India there is a time zone that's like 11
Well,
and a half or 12 and
well,
a
I
half.
mean, yeah, India is a few hours ahead of me, like a whole day ahead of you.
Yeah. So basically, anybody could be any time zone right now.
Yes, absolutely. All right, I think I'm not seeing any more attendees joining now, so let's start. Over the course of the last few weeks, we've done quite a few interviews. We basically did a research trying to learn more about the way companies deal with SharePoint, the way they extend it to their needs, and we learned quite a few things. So it turns out that everybody, I mean, you could expect that. Everybody extends SharePoint to their needs because, to be honest, that's truly the only way to benefit the most out of the ability it offers. So everybody extends it to their needs. But then the one thing that we learned is that actually not everybody is truly aware of what that means and what that means with regards to impact on performance, security, compliance. So with that, we thought that we would share with you a few things that we learned along the way as we talked to companies who are both on premises in a cloud, either using versions going from SharePoint 2013 up or already in a cloud as well. So yeah, with that, let us talk to you a bit more about what we learned. One thing from the org point of view, if there's anything you'd like to ask, please do, but do this through the Zoom Q&A box, because that way we'll be able to see this more easily. It's way easier for us to keep track of that than to just look at the chat. And then if we will not get to answer the question you ask, we will get back to you afterwards. The event is recorded, so you'll be able to get all of that afterwards. So with that, let's get directly to it. So the one thing that was an eye-opening to me is that not everybody keeps track of what they do. As I said, everybody extend SharePoint to their needs, and it turns out that not everybody is aware of that, because depending to whom you talk, some think of it that, well, we don't really build apps, we don't build WSPs, we don't build add-ins, we don't use SPFX, right? We only allow people to use SharePoint the way it is out of the box. But as such, like, there are a few things that they are unaware of, right? Because users can add a piece of script to the page, or they can build a flow or power app, right? And as such, they can tailor the whole environment to their specific needs, but with these additions having a big impact on the whole environment, right? So it always starts with, no matter what you want to do, it always starts with trying to understand what you have. And it's not a trivial thing, right? And I guess, Liam, you know that too, right? That there is no single page you can go to or single location that shows you everything that has been extended or added. And there's even, from API point of view, there is no unified way to get that across service, right? So I don't know, Liam, if you can share anything from your experience, how companies to whom you talked deal with that or approach it, or what is the state of their environments?
Yeah, so I think companies go into various kind of buckets, and obviously some of them go the one extreme where anything and everything that's ever done to a SharePoint environment, whether it's in the cloud or on premises, is kind of like strictly controlled. And then you have the rest of the world, I suppose, that basically just, they spend all of this time trying to protect the physical infrastructure, make sure you can authenticate properly and all that kind of fun stuff, and then actually just do exactly what in all fairness, Microsoft have asked us to do, which is to encourage collaboration and sharing and delegation of access controls and things like that into the SharePoint environment, which the downside to that is that you grant people access to make those kind of changes that you talked about, Waldeck, you know, the ability to add a web part to a page, because the idea being that you want to give them and empower your end users to make those types of changes. And having done a whole bunch of different types of audits, for example, in Office 365 and on premises, the story is exactly the same. It's almost identical. It's quite uncanny because we often like to think as an organization that we do something different to everybody else.
Right.
That my environment is unique and nobody else in the world uses SharePoint like I use SharePoint. But in actual fact, we all use it exactly the same. We all put documents in, we all build team sites, we all do permissions incorrectly half the time. We all tag the content in the wrong way or the right way. Search doesn't always work. We don't want it to look like SharePoint. We hack it together to make what we want it to make. And we allow the end users or the business power users to kind of feel empowered to do whatever they want to. And then we sit back in 6 months' time and then something happens and we're like, well, how did that happen? Like, how were they able to do that? And that's because we just kind of allow these things to happen.
Exactly.
So what I do see a lot of is, like you said, people adding things to a page. I mean, so I actually gave a webinar last night. And in the webinar, I said, go to your favorite internet search engine, so go to Google or Bing or whatever, and look for something that you want to do in SharePoint. So let's say you want to make the rows in a list view web part different colors. Like nothing spectacular. And of course, we know we can do this in different ways now, but just have a look at how many blog posts come up that reference either a content editor web part or a script editor web part with a piece of JavaScript in that'll do it for you. And then realize that there's about 1,000 people in the world that have blogged about this same thing and made the code freely available. And then times that by the amount of people that would have gone, oh, that's what I want to do. So they take the code and put it in a page. And so this little piece of code that, for example, I would have come up with to do it now exponentially appears in SharePoint environments all over the world because that's what I wanted as a business user. That's what I see. That's what I see all the time.
Right, right, and I guess it all eyes back to what we said, right? That in order to have the control, in order to know what the script can do in your environment, it all starts with having an overview of what you actually have. What kind of scripts have been added by users, by the IT, by everyone, and to use that as the baseline to actually improve the posture of your whole environment, right? And I guess so. If we look, for example, at example, like what are the specific things that can be, or things that you can add, things you can change, and what kind of impact do they have on your environment, right? So one of the things that we see a lot, and this has changed over the years, because in the past we used to build managed code, we used to ship DLLs to servers and run server-side code, but as more and more and more we move towards the cloud, where we cannot do that because Microsoft will never ever ever allow us to deploy our DLLs to their farms, like we had to come up with a different way of doing things, right? And as such, as you said, it all comes down to, in different shapes and sizes, to a piece of scripts that can be added to the environment to either do a simple thing like show the weather or color a row, to maybe even fully blown bespoke apps, right? Because you could build, for example, an Angular app, let's say, and you could add that to the page. And one of the things, so as the things that we build are more and more and more client side based, it turns out that we tend to, or we strive to be efficient. So as such, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to build the same thing over and over again. And the good news is that if you look, for example, on NPM, right, which is the location of libraries, you can think of it as catalog of things that have been built by others. I think the last time I looked, there were over 700,000 packages available for devs to use. 700,000. right? So any of them you can just pick, you can reuse that, build on that, perfectly fine. The problem with that is that once you embed that in whatever you build, whatever you put in your portal page, at that point, that script can do anything that the person who is currently on the intranet is allowed to, right? So that script can do on behalf of that person anything the person is allowed to. So if the person is CEO, well, that script, you can imagine, does a lot, right? So as more and more and more we use these existing building blocks and we pull them in our intranets, the more important thing is to realize, have you checked if there are any gaps or or any holes in them that could be exploited to do something harmful in your environment, right? And the research that we've done is we've done analysis of a number of environments, and we found out that on average, there were, in the things that we analyzed, were 6 vulnerable scripts. But like one extreme that we've seen was that in one environment, and we didn't even analyze the whole thing, right? So we did analysis of just a few sites. We found 480 vulnerable scripts. Liam, are you still in your chair?
Yeah, I think I stepped off the chair and I'm on the floor like, hey, Manny.
Yeah, exactly. So 480 vulnerable script, just a few sites that we and that we analyze in an environment.
So the interesting thing about that, and this is one thing that I've kind of seen over the years as well, when it comes to things like vulnerable scripts and things like that in SharePoint, is of course what often happens is, remember how we brand and style and things like that in SharePoint, that we often create these packages that we kind of reuse again and again and again and again. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, with the organic growth of SharePoint, which, I mean, I've yet to meet anybody that says their SharePoint environment hasn't organically grown. What tends to happen, what tends to happen is that if we, for example, embed a piece of JavaScript, for example, in a page layout, or maybe in it's on a specific page that we create in every single site, or it's a custom site template or something else, that every time we create new versions of these things, it just grows and grows and grows. So that example there, for example, the 481 vulnerable scripts could technically have just been one script, but now it's 481 scripts because maybe someone tweaked it a little, they added something different, or they used the same one and recreated it again.
Yep.
But that's what happens. It's this. I mean, I ran one recently where it maxed out at about 500, where there was 500 vulnerable things in the SharePoint site, and it
Yeah.
was using libraries and things that, because they're kind of available. I think this is one of the issues that we face, is that because somebody will write something and make it available, it's that whole open source idea, which I really like. But of course, because somebody blogs about it and says this is the JavaScript you can use, it almost becomes like it's allowed. It's like, oh, well, Joe Blogs wrote about it, so it's got to be okay.
Right.
So I'm going to put it in the site. And it's almost like a weird inherent trust because it's on a blog post that lots of people have read. So we're okay to use it. And
Yeah.
then we introduce these vulnerabilities because, of course, especially using things like jQuery or whatever else, like I've seen so many environments where like the version of a framework that's being used is so old that nobody's updated it because it would be too hassle to update it. And but jQuery does have vulnerabilities and it continues to be fixed like over
Right.
time. But nobody fixes it because it's like, oh well, I have to go and change that. And then you find that some of the signatures for the methods have changed from what they were before. And so you don't want to fix it. So you're like, ah, screw it, I'll just leave it with version 1. It'll be fine.
Right. 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 And I guess so that brings us to an interesting thing that I've heard a few times as well, right? How bad is that, right? Because just because
Mhm.
there is vulnerable element in your code, well, doesn't mean that you have to address it, right? Because like especially on npm, some of the packages that are there are meant to be used in the context of Node, which is server-side code, right? So just because it is there doesn't mean to for you that you have to address it. And then another thing that I'd like everyone to keep in mind is that like the scripts that you pull in, this is not an anonymously available internet site, right? So it's harder for someone to exploit that. And it might be, for example, that one script would exploit a hole in another script that is on a page. But it's not like a person, anybody from internet can just come to your site and exploit a hole in your script. No, because that script is a part of your intranet, which is not anonymously available, right? So it is something that you should pay attention to, but it's not a major thing that should drop everything else that you do and address it now. But there is another thing that we see a lot as well, which is the fact that as we use more and more and more of these things that have been built by others, another approach that we use is that we don't pull it in, but we reference it from a URL that is available on internet, right? So imagine I would build a widget that shows the weather. I would make it available on GitHub or anywhere else. And instead of for you to pull it in and to actually to host it by yourself, you can just point to my location, and then every single time I would, for example, do an update or add something new, you would get by default already all these updates without any effort. So that sounds perfect, right?
Mhm.
But if you think about it, what does that mean? That means that my script that I control, not you, right? Because it's beyond your environment, it's in my environment. I can update as I please, and you cannot do anything about it. And through that script, I can access anything in your environment on behalf of the person who is currently on that page, right? So if you think about what could potentially do more harm, whether that's vulnerable script or an external script, I could argue, or I would argue actually, that an external script, a script that you do not own, script that you don't know who's allowed to change and when and how and why, that script could potentially do way more harm than a script that has a known issue but is beyond your login. Liam, your take on that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's that difference of understanding the purpose of the script that's being utilized. So if it's a framework, a well-known framework like jQuery or something else like that, where it's controlled and you're referencing it from a CDN or whatever else that's managed, unless the CDN itself is compromised or whatever else, the odds are that a well-known framework like jQuery is probably not going to end up being completely swapped by Waldeck. it's just not, like, unless you suddenly can do that. But for other things, the smaller things that we often utilize, then yes, I mean, like you said, I mean, if you reference, so I go back to something that I did years ago, and I've mentioned this in the past before. I wrote a web part and gave it away for nothing, which was my claims viewer web part. Nothing spectacular. It was never going to hack your environment. It was literally just so you could view claims in SharePoint when you did authentication. And I gave it away as a free web part. You can do whatever you want to with it, knock yourself out. And what I actually ended up finding was that every environment that I ever audited over the past 20 years basically ended up having that web part installed at some point in their environment. And I
Right.
would ask the question and say, well, did you check it? And sometimes people would know that it was me that had done it, and other times people wouldn't. And so they would, no, 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 it's fine. I'm like, well, how do you know it's fine? Like, and I would sit there and like I know it's fine, but it's like, how do you know this?
Well, is it, right?
Yeah. I mean, I can say, touch wood, that my code was actually okay. Like, it wasn't doing anything really bad, and it was managed code and whatever. And I was just like, but you don't know this. Like, you don't know this. You inherently trusted, because Liam had created the web part and given it away for free, that it must be okay. And
Right.
actually, that's the problem, because, like you said, in that scenario where I inherently trust something, I could have, in that code, I could have had it referencing something else and had it automatically pull something into your environment, and you would never know.
Yeah.
And so, like, that's the issue. And you know what? It's been ever since the early versions of 2003 when we started doing it, or even back to MCMS days or whatever else. This is a
Hmm.
problem that hasn't gone away. Like, we still have the same issue. There's in this inherent weird trust with something that's outside because it does what we want it to do. So we don't seem to question it, and we just kind of add it. I mean, even to some extent, I mean, if we mention SharePoint Framework, like, I really like SharePoint Framework, but I can add all kinds of different things into a SharePoint Framework web part because it's all NPM packages. And I could, and you've read in the news of the npm packages that have had to be removed and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it's that kind of thing. Like, we need to get better at validating and checking what it is that we're expecting to utilize and where that comes from,
Yeah,
especially
yeah.
if it comes from Waldeck.
Yeah. Um, and I guess that, so that reminds me a bit of, there was a case, I think it was last year, February, where I think it would be 4,000 or 40,000 uh, government site all over the world would use service, which was a third-party service that would allow you to read up the contents of your web page, right? And all of that was used on anonymous sites.
Yep.
Right, and basically the goal that was to make the contents more accessible. So if person would be visually impaired, they could use the feature to read up the page, and they would use it as plugin from a vendor. What they didn't know, and nobody really knows for how long it ran, but it turns out that at some point someone saw that all these sites mined coins, bitcoins, right? And what turns out to be the case, that external script was hacked. And nobody really knows why or how, but the problem is because all of these sites referenced an external script without integrity hash. So in other words, without verifying or having a checksum to verify whether the contents are still original and haven't been changed anywhere, they would just pull in the change as if it was an update, but that script was hacked at some point by somebody, and then it would mine coins on all these sites across the world. Right, so the argument, well, but there are so many other people who use that, or it has to be safe because it's X. Well, no, because in the end, like, things can be hacked, right? And sure, if it's anonymous site where, well, you can only do that much harm, right? Sure, on an anonymous site, if you have a form, if you accept payments, sure, there is more harm to be done. But when you think about your intranet, when you store confidential documents, sensitive documents, when you have personnel info, that script could do so much more harm than only mine coins, right? So you should definitely keep track of what you pull in and who has the access to that, right? Because we're talking about your intranet, your company, and not an anonymous site that everybody can see anyway, right? And when we talk about the libraries that you can use, like as we said, we can use a lot of them. There are over 700,000 available on npm. And the interesting part of that is that, like Liam, as you said, like intranet does not or intranets grow over time. They are not like day one, you ship something and it's done and it stays for X amount of years, right? It grows over time, it evolves. And from my experience, what I've seen a lot is that typically people don't fix what ain't broke. If you would like, so you build something and it works, and you don't touch that unless there is need for a change or something goes wrong, right? So over time, you accumulate a number of solutions, scripts, widgets, each of them using different technology, different version. One would be using jQuery 1, the other one jQuery 1.5, jQuery 2, and so forth and so on. In the end, leaving you with a big surface that could be used to exfiltrate the data or do harm, right? So if you are really to take care of that you really want to secure your environment, if you think about that, now you have not one thing to keep an eye out on, but many of them, right? Because every day you should check, is there a patch for jQuery 1? Is there a patch for jQuery 1.1? Is there a patch for jQuery 1.2? What about jQuery 2? What about Angular and React? What about Vue? So all the different libraries that you have across your environment, you need to keep track of what you have, and then keep track of, is there anything that needs to be addressed, right? So that is the aspect, or security aspect is one. Two, imagine that on one page you would use jQuery 1, on the other jQuery 1.5, jQuery 2, and so on. Performance-wise, users will need to pull all of them in, right? Even if they're on the same page, users would be downloading basically the same kind of code, because sure, they might be differences between jQuery 1 and jQuery 2, but whatever jQuery 1 could do, jQuery 2 could do too, right? So you could improve performance for users a lot if you knew that you use multiple of them, either in a single page or even across the whole intranet, and then try to think, okay, which version, let's decide a version and let's try to use that across the whole intranet and not let every page or every area do their own thing, right? So that is also an aspect. And then from support point of view as well, right? Because if you would read, for example, a bulletin that would say update jQuery 1.3 to at least 1.4 because there was issue, right? So now you have to keep an eye on that. Okay, do I have that or not? And you need to check that across the whole intranet, right? And the thing that we've seen through our analysis is that on average, there are three different libraries with multiple versions in an environment, but sometimes we've seen as many as 60 different libraries with more than one version used within a piece of intranet based on SharePoint. Liam, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, because I just went through this with a client, the same kind of process. And sure enough, every single site collection that I ran through, so I ran through about 10 of them. And what's interesting is I kind of had an expectation of what I would see, but actually I was quite surprised because, like you said, there wasn't a consolidation of libraries being used. Each site collection was actually different. And what was even weirder is the versions were different in each of the site collections too. So what you ended up with is you ended up with, 10 different libraries being used in site collection 1, 3 in site collection 2, 25 in site collection 3, and then multiple versions. And actually the ratio is quite interesting. It was normally, if you had 10 different libraries that were being used or that were referenced, over half of those would be different versions of the same thing. And that was consistent across every single one. So that means that somebody had been putting things into the site with the same thing and using different versions every single time, and even more in different site collections as well. So
Right.
that was quite intriguing to me to see that, we talk about best practice development practices and all that kind of stuff. And actually, I think from the managed code side, it was a little bit easier because it was Visual Studio, you had team building and all that kind of stuff, and then we checked everything and put it in. But when it comes to client side, that seems to be a big problem, that we don't seem to have this model ironed out exactly the way that we should do, where we are picking up the fact that we've got 75 different dependencies on different versions in the same code on the same site collection in different subsites. We don't seem to do that. There doesn't seem to be a methodology that's been adopted widely as of yet by at least organizations that we've done the work with to kind of get past this issue. And I expect to see more of this as we
Right.
continue with the health assessments and look at them, that we'll see more and more and more of this. And even in this isn't isolated to on-premises either. I mean, I've ran this in multiple Office 365 in SharePoint Online tenants. And it's
Absolutely.
exactly the same problem. Just too many different libraries, too many different versions, because obviously when someone's building something, they'll say, wait, it doesn't do that. Oh, the new version does. So instead of fixing all the rest, they'll just add the other version to it and carry on because it's
Right.
easier.
Right. Right. And I guess that maybe it has for a part to do with the fact that in a past it wasn't as common practice to pull, for example, something from NuGet and to include that in project, right? Maybe
Mhm.
maybe that was inherent to the times back then that there wasn't so much available, and now it is. I don't know, but that's definitely something that you should definitely pay attention to.
Mhm.
And we've heard or we've seen a lot that some companies are not fine. They don't feel good about the fact that everybody can do in their environment whatever they please, right? So they experience firsthand that allowing everybody to embed scripts anywhere they want in the environment might not be the most robust way to grow internet and to empower everybody and stay safe and compliant. And but then on the other hand, it's also not a scalable approach to let everything to be done only by the IT, right? Because there are only that many people there, and they cannot cater to every single need across a whole company, right? So a while back, Microsoft released the idea of a site collection app catalog as a mean to scale deployments and scale the ownership of apps across the company, right? So in the past, if you think about it, there was one catalog available across the whole environment, and whatever you wanted to have, it would go through that central place in your environment. Now, with this new ability, you can enable, or tenants admins can enable specific site collections to have catalog of their own. And at that stage, site collection admins can actually manage and approve these apps. And it's a great way to scale the ownership. But then on the other hand, the one thing that I've seen is that, so on the one hand, not many companies use it yet. But on the other hand, the more they do, the more they start to realize that oftentimes site collection owners are business people. They are not IT people. But the moment you empower them to deploy applications, they might not be um, sufficiently equipped with abilities to actually assess the packages that they're putting in production, right? Liam, have you seen anything alike?
Yeah, I mean, even using some of the newer approach, like with the SharePoint framework and things like that. I mean, having worked with a client recently where, and this was an interesting model where in their Office 365 tenant in their SharePoint Online sites, they obviously had restricted access, but of course, I was one of the people building the solutions that were going to ultimately end up in the app catalog, so they could actually just add in, the app parts or whatever else they wanted to do. And so what we actually found, which was really intriguing to me, is that we would write the code, we would test it, we would make sure it worked, and then we would basically package everything up and say, okay, here's all the stuff, it needs to go into the catalog now. And what would actually happen is that we would get on a webinar session with the IT person, we would give them the files, and they would just upload it and authorize it.
Hmm.
Like nobody would check it. Nobody tested the code. They didn't look at it and go, well, does it work? Does it not work? They would literally just take what we gave them, and the admins would just be like, okay, let's move forward. Done. And they would authorize it.
But I mean, why? So why it isn't? So would you say that it's because they assume that somebody else did that already, or did they feel like it wasn't their job? Why do you
I,
think they
I think
did
it's
it
probably,
that way?
yeah, I think it's probably a mix. I think they probably didn't feel like it was their job because they were just the IT team, and they have most IT people obviously have so many things that they're working on that getting on a webinar with a contractor, for example, a vendor that's coming in and doing the work that just needs to upload some stuff to make it work. They're just like, fine, let's get on a call. What do I need to do? Done, 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 done. And that's it. They don't even question it. And when it comes up with the box that says, you need to authorize this from the admin side to say, yes, he needs full read control or whatever else to the site or whatever, they just go, yeah, that's fine, and do it. They don't check it because,
Hmm.
I mean, technically, as an IT admin, they just want they want it to work. They want their users to just get on with stuff, and they have so many other things to worry about. So I think there's an element of that, and then technically, I think there's an element of trust too, the inherent trust. If you come to a vendor, a specialist vendor that can do the development for you, then you kind of almost have an expectation that they will build it in the way that you expect them to build it, and they're not going to do anything dangerous or bad in the code. So why would I need to check it?
Well, I mean, there's the whole thing that, so sure, on one hand, you could think, well, that person might want to do, or might want to do harm intentionally, but I think
Mm-hmm.
that that's not the case, right? I think
Yeah.
that oftentimes people really want to do the right thing, and they just do something wrong by coincidence,
Yep.
or by accident, right?
Yep. Yep.
Cool. Yeah, so that's something, that's a additional area for everybody who runs or who manages and environment to look at, right? So yes, it is a great way to scale the ability to deploy applications, but it's also a one way to, or an additional way for for apps to gain access to areas that they should not have the access to, right? Because if you think about different technologies that can be used to build apps, for example, an add-in, for add-in, you could say this add-in operates only within the context of that particular site, right? So an add-in physically would not be allowed to do anything in a different site unless you explicitly allowed it to. But that isn't the case, for example, in SPFX, right? Because in SPFX, what you do is you build piece of script that is added on a page, and that script is an inherent part of that page. As such, there is no way for you to limit the access to that other than permission of the person who is on the page. So the CEO would come to your page, that piece of script running on that page would be able to access anything that the CEO is allowed to access. And this is why it's extremely important for you to vet, basically check whether the code that you are about to put in production is safe, right? And it's not meant as you cannot trust the person who built the package, but it's more about maybe they didn't see on something, or maybe more often, maybe something changed since that thing was built, right? Because maybe there is a known issue, maybe there's something else, maybe somebody changed something else, right? So in other words, you should not blindly assume that just because it's coming from somebody whom you've seen in real life, that it's fine, right? Because you don't know, right? And then another area that we've seen being increasingly used is the ability to allow developers to access APIs in your environment, right? So for example, if you think about it, the power of the cloud is to be able to, or to expose the data to, for example, things like Exchange or email or Planner or Task or anything that is available in 365, right? But in order to be able to access that info, you first need to authenticate. And for all these years, actually, auth was always the biggest part, the biggest hurdle developers needed to go through, right? And on premises, it's still a challenge, right? Because there is no easy way, for example, to access an API, or maybe there's even not as much insights available as you have available in a cloud, right? Because on premises, you might still have only SharePoint and files, whether in a cloud you already have and Teams and Outlook and Calendar and Planner and Tasks and whatnot, right? So it's in theory easier to tap into that and build apps that actually use all of this info that is available to you anyway. But always the first step is auth. And recently, we got the ability in a cloud to, or tenant admins got the ability to choose which APIs secured with Azure AD they want to expose to developers. So as such, developers have simplified access to these APIs. And that's an interesting thing, right? Because on one hand, being an admin, you want to empower your company to do more, right? Because you buy a service and it's being used, more and more info is being stored all over the place. So why not tap into that and let people make better use of that, right? But then, on the other hand, if you think about it, like the moment you allow these APIs to be used, any piece of script across the whole intranet can use these APIs too, right? Because you open them up. You allow scripts in your environment to use that. Now, they are meant, like the idea behind this is that, for example, if you think about SPFX packages are built by developers and deployed by admins. Like end users cannot deploy packages themselves, right? That is just impossible. So in this world, admins know upfront which scripts are running in their environment. But then when you go, for example, to the world from which we come, right? The world where users can embed any piece of script they want on a page through the content editor web part, script editor web part, any piece of script you put on a page could access that API. Imagine that you would allow scripts to read your email because you want to have a web part, for example, on the homepage of your intranet that allows you to see like your latest 5 emails or the 5 upcoming appointments. If you would pull, if you would have somewhere in your intranet, for example, a widget that shows weather, or the widget that shows traffic jams, or anything else like stocks, right? That piece of script could, in theory, use the same APIs to gain access to your email, to email of the person who is currently on a page. That script could do that. So as such, like, before you allow that as an admin, you should have a good understanding of what different scripts are there in your environment that could, in theory, tap into that. Liam, your take on that. Have you seen that already being used in practice? And if so,
Yeah,
how?
yeah. For example, I'm doing some work right now with a client where we're actually actively using the Microsoft Graph API in components. And so we're actually having to go through that process of assigning access to the APIs that we need. So for example, I have access to read all the values in the Azure Active Directory. I have access, for example, to create invitations for external guest users and things like that. Because when you actually look at the permission sets that are available for an API, there's actually a lot. I mean, like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them in the list that you
Right.
can actually associate. And of course, the difficulty is, which is kind of what you're alluding to, is that when you do assign permissions to things, it's never a, oh, this is the application that can use that API. Because once you create, for example, the app registration and I create the secret and the client code and everything else, I can then use that for anything going forward. So any kind of request at that point, whether it's the code that was originally intended to call it or whether it's something else, it really makes no difference. I just need that specific information. And then I
Well,
can go ahead and do it.
so actually, there is something that you mentioned just now. We currently have a preview available of
Mm-hmm.
technology to grant permission to an app. And
Yeah.
if you think about SPFX, in SPFX you can build web parts and extensions. So a web part is a widget on a page, and then extension can be a banner, footer, something that will run on more than a single page.
Mm-hmm.
And currently we have preview available for us to be able to assign permissions to a specific web part. So not to grant them to every piece of script across the whole internet, but just say
Mm-hmm.
this one web part will now be able to access email.
Yep.
Right? So that could, in theory, address what you mentioned, right?
Yep. So
Yeah.
in theory,
Do explain.
yeah. So it's like anything. So one of the things that I tend to have lots of conversations about is, I go and speak to somebody who has a tenant, an Office 365, and I'll say, hey, have you enabled this, 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 this? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. Did you enable this? Did you enable that? Did you enable multi-factor authentication? Did you enable this? Did you enable that? And a lot of the time, the answer comes back to no. And
Why?
90% of the time, it's based around two things. One is either lack of knowing how to do that and what the impact of doing that would be. And then the second one comes down to licensing and being able to pay for certain features that you would
Right.
expect to have. And so what I tend to find is that 9 times out of 10, what happens is it's almost blanket access type would be granted because it's just much easier than trying to figure out, the ins and outs of how those
Mhm.
things work. And so that's one of the issues that we find. I can go to one of my clients I work with and say, I need this specific access. And they'll be like, okay. And they grant me access. There's never like a long conversation of, well, why do you need that one? It's like,
Right, right, right,
and,
right,
and I could get away without having that level. I don't need write access to the directory,
right.
but I ask for that and I'll get it. And it's like an interesting thing. So I think there's an element of it's,
Trust?
yeah, trust, lack of understanding of what that really means. Like, what does it really mean when you add user.read write all permissions? Like,
Right,
what am I actually allowed to do?
right.
And lots of it is documented, but lots of it isn't documented either. And so I think there's an element of that too, that, you know, we know what we know and we don't know what we don't know type
Oh
thing.
yeah, yeah. Okay, cool. And then another aspect is like as we said at the start, like it all starts with knowing what you have. And a part of that is related to the fact that we found out that only 6 out of 10 companies keep track of the things that the IT does. Right? So if you think about package apps like SPFX or add-ins, WSPs, 6 out of 10 companies have an up-to-date list of these apps. But then we also saw that nobody really keeps track of what users do. Now, and that has been an issue over the years, right? Because over the years, we would have experienced firsthand that somebody would add a piece of script to the page, nobody would know anything about it, then something breaks, support gets a ticket, and they have no idea because they don't know that piece of code because they've never seen it. Right, so a part of that, trying to move everybody forward, Microsoft came up with the idea of modern experiences. In modern experiences, modern sites, one of the things, like we can do plenty of things and they work better out of the box, and there are many more investments being done to basically improve the whole experience. But in order to be able to guarantee that, one of the things that we are not allowed to do by default is to embed scripts, because these scripts or these modern sites are by default locked down. Now, a person who has the access to that could potentially remove the lock and allow users to embed scripts again, but that would basically bring us back to the past, right? Back to the, let's say, the Wild West environment where everybody can do whatever they like, assuming they can edit a page, right? So it all starts with knowing where users can embed scripts. And you have to, like, just because there's a modern site, you cannot assume that it is safe. Sure, it's safe by default, but who's to say that that has not been changed, either by an app that you use because it needs that to function, or by somebody who would flip the switch or something, right? So, and then there's still the fact that if you have your intranet for more than a year or 2 years, the odds are high that you still have classic sites in it. And these sites by default do allow embedding scripts, right? So you should, as part of trying to build a list of all applications that you have across your whole environment, you should also think of that where users can embed script and keep track of these sites as well. A part of that or the things related to that is that when users embed applications or embed scripts, um, there is a chance that they might embed something from an external URL, like for example, something that shows stocks, or something that shows traffic jams, the weather, and these seem like irrelevant things at first. But over time, users get accustomed to them, that they are there, that they can find specific info there. And the problem with that is that if these applications are external, because they are owned by someone else, it could be the case that that location has different SLA than the rest of your intranet. So as such, it could be the case that one day people will come to intranet and they will see an error where they used to see the weather or stocks. Who do you think they will reach out to? Support, right, Liam?
Yep. They'll call support and say, it's not working. And then you guys will have to try and figure out exactly what it is at that point. That's what will happen.
Exactly.
I've seen that 1,000 times, because even though it's in a weird scenario, even though it's, you know, support's job to fix it, you guys didn't put it there, but I put it there as a business user. You're there to support me. And so I'm going to say, well, you guys have to fix it now, even though I put it on the page.
Yeah. 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 So it's also an interesting thing to realize that the moment you take dependency on something you do not own, you have to take into account that there might be a different SLA on that. So there will be one. Two, if you don't pay close attention to servers from which these assets are coming, it could be that they will slow down your intranet, right? Because it might take a moment for them to load. And if these locations aren't optimized, it could be just the case that they won't be cached. So everybody who is coming to the page will need to reload that time over time over time, meaning the whole internet will be slower. Not to mention the burden on your network, right? So it's also something that you need to take into account the moment you allow people to embed apps from locations that you do not own yourself. And then finally, the last thing that we wanted to share with you is something that we've seen a lot over the years, right? We would see, for example, like Liam, and I think you mentioned that already, like what is or how can I do X? And 9 out of 10 times you will see something that involves adding a piece of script to the page, and that will make anything look the way you want it to. It will move options around the page. It will change the way they are displayed. It will show web parts as tabs to refer to a colleague or a friend of ours. Um, it will color the calendar. It will do whatever you want it to do. But it's all based on a premise that there are known elements on a page, and that you can refer to them by location or a name or anything, right? Or a tag or just something that you know about the page. This might have worked once in the past. Like in the world where we are on premises, you would update your environment maybe every year, maybe every 3 years, depending on your pace, and you would be able to test all of that up front. In a cloud, Office 365 gets an update every week. Every week there is a chance that elements on the page might change. They might be shifted to accommodate something new. They might have changed because something didn't work, right? And the last thing you want is to be in business where you need to check your pages every single day. Does it still work? Right? So we've seen a lot of these over the years, like dependencies or apps that are built basically making assumptions about elements on the page and how they look. And this is something that you should not do, because it will get you in trouble, especially in a cloud where things move really, really fast. Liam, any experiences with that?
Yeah, I
Of
mean, it's
course you
actually,
do. You probably
yeah.
built a few of them by yourself, right?
Yeah, weirdly.
Who
Yeah,
hasn't?
yeah, who hasn't? I was going to say, I mean, if you're a SharePoint dev, you will have done page DOM manipulation at some point, because that's just historically the way that you would make changes. You're going to
Right.
inject something into the page, you're going to tweak something, you're going to make it do something it wasn't intended to do. Now, of course, what I did a few months ago, and Waldeck may remember, is I actually spent some time trying to write code in JavaScript that would be code that you guys wouldn't write. Like I wanted it to do something to the DOM that it shouldn't do, just to see like what I could get away with inside SharePoint framework. So of course the idea being someone deploys a SharePoint framework component, which is obviously modern on the page, but I can still do other stuff to the DOM that I wouldn't really want it to do. So for example, a silly example would be I had it so it would simply inject hidden objects into the page that would have the source of the object. So for example, take an image. I injected a 1 pixel by 1 pixel image into the page, set the source of the image to be HTML, and then embedded JavaScript as the body of the image. So it wasn't really an image. And then I spawned an execution of that JavaScript from within that 1 pixel by 1 pixel. Something, and I had it visibly pop up and say, hello, type thing. So almost like a cross-site scripting attack. But nothing spectacular. But the premise was that it was actually very, very straightforward to write something that I could put here's my new SharePoint framework web part that I've released to the world. It's going to give you some banner images and a whole bunch of cool stuff. But under the covers, I'm injecting malicious code that was obfuscated, that no one knew what it did, but it was inside the page.
Right. Right.
So, and that's like it's, and that's not anything SharePoint specific. So I think that's one thing to remember. Modifying the DOM and all that kind of stuff is not really anything unique to SharePoint. But what is unique about it is that most users technically have that permission to be able to put stuff in the page and modify the actual DOM itself. So just remember, like, try to not make a DOM change unless you really, really have to. And if you do, you're going to have to keep checking it if you're in the cloud, just purely based on that. And I actually like the phrase where you say the DOM's not an API, because I think too frequently we utilize the DOM as an API to build the bits and pieces that we need, when really we should just build an actual component to do what we want it to do.
Right, right. So to recap, there are many, many ways in which we can extend SharePoint beyond what is available out of the box, right? We can build workflows in the cloud. We can build flows. We can build Power Apps. We can add pieces of script to the page. We can build custom actions. We can do plenty of things, right? And the one thing that they all have in common is that it's impossible for you to keep track of all of them because there are so many ways, there are so many different shapes of them, and it's so easy for users to just do them because we actually want them to do that, but we also want to stay safe and compliant. So at Rencore, we came up with an idea to basically help you to understand what you have in your environment. I think it's probably the easiest way to check if there is something that requires your attention or not. So the health check that we've built is a free application that you can run directly from laptop. It doesn't require any install on your farm or anything alike, and that will give you within minutes that inside that answer to, is there something or is there anything that requires my attention now? Do I have external scripts that I do not that I didn't know I have? Is there vulnerable scripts referenced in my environment? Um, Anything, right? So we have a number of checks that we include within these app that you can just check for free and find out for yourself. And we have some really great things coming up to that, such as think about flow and power apps analysis, right? What if we could also expand that to teams? So these are the things that you can expect to see added as a part of the health check over the coming weeks and months, basically to give you the idea, to give you the power to quickly check, is there anything that requires my attention? Is there anything that I need to fix in my environment or not? So with that, I think we have a minute or two left for Q&A, if anybody would like to answer anything now. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate that you were here. If there's anything, these are our emails. You can reach out to us at any time. And with that, let's stay here a minute or two to see if anything comes through. So while we're waiting on questions, Liam, you've used health check a few times, right? How did
Yeah.
you? What was the first thing, or what was the thing that took your, or that took your attention?
I think the first time I ran it was really, I mean, I've worked in many, many SharePoint environments, and so I kind of had an idea of the sheer number of things that I would expect to see. But I think when I ran it the first time, that was probably the most important, which was like, I didn't realize that a site collection had 500 content editor web parts, or
Right.
500 script editor web parts, or even like 120 infopath forms, because you have an idea of what you expect to see. But when you start seeing those kind of numbers, that was actually pretty heavy. And
Right.
I was a bit taken aback by that.
Right. We have a question. How do you normally handle testing with dev, QA, tenant, and then deploying to prod? So typically the way so at Rencore, we offer a platform that allows you to basically have these checks end to end. So we have a tool set that comprises of over 1,200 rules that check from anything from security to performance, correctness, best practices that we've learned over the years, and so forth and so on. And you can integrate that throughout DevOps process end to end. So devs can integrate that in Visual Studio, Studio Code. So as they write code, they can get immediately feedback whether there's something that they should address or not. Then you can also integrate all of that into your builds, right? So that every single time you run a build, you also have that check against our extensive set of rules that will also check that, is there anything in your code that you should address? Then the next step is, imagine that you have a package, right? So if it's built by your own team, you could have checked that through the code and build. But what if that's something that you've bought, or what if that's something that you only got a package from, but you don't have the source code. So for that, you can also use our tooling, because we don't analyze source code. We analyze the package that comes out of it in the end, right? So for example, if you would build DLL, we don't need source code to analyze that. We will analyze DLL and we'll tell you exactly what is wrong, right? And then, so that would be, let's say, for the IT-driven applications. But then there's everything that users can add directly to pages and sites. And for that, we offer a platform that monitors your tenant all the time. And every single time we pick up a piece of script that has been added, or a flow or a Power App, we will grab that, analyze that, and give you directly insights. Or is there anything that requires your attention? Is there a vulnerable script, or is it external reference that requires your attention? Right, so we offer that end-to-end coverage from developers who build packaged apps to even including the production environment or your dev QA, and also in the end in production, where users can put applications directly to pages. And we are 1 minute over time, but there are still attendees, and we have one more question. Is there a resource for SharePoint framework development, like a quick start, or the like you guys provide? So we offer an ebook named SPFX for admins, which explains to admins, to non-developer audience, what SPFX is, what the package anatomy is, what is that comprised for, and how you go around it. We don't do that for devs because the P&P team has done tremendous job writing the guidance for SPFX. So if you would go to docs.microsoft.com/SharePoint/dev, you'll get all of the guidance there already. So as such, we thought that there is no need for us to offer yet another piece of info, because it's already there. And there are training courses, there are other resources as well. So as such, we thought like there's no need for us to add to that yet another thing. Have one question. So there's another one, which is, can you inherit out of the box web parts so that we can manipulate accordingly, for example, news? Unfortunately, you cannot. So you cannot extend first-party web parts yet because their code isn't available. So for now, you can only use, or you can only build the web parts from scratch. You cannot extend anything that is available out of the box. Oh yeah, and there's the same question typed differently. Okay. I think we're good. We're 3 minutes over time. So once again, thank you for attending. The recording will be made available for everybody who signed up for the webinar. You will get an email about it, and stay in touch if there's anything to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you.